So I got around to playing Mouthwashing. Amazing game, and I recommend you play it for yourself before you even get into this video. Because this was a different type of horror than the usual jump scare horror. The storytelling in it really takes you on a journey, which gives the game a unique replay value even after the story's over. But to get to the point, I want to talk about today the crew and where everything went wrong. Because I believe there are about 3 main issues that led to the downfall of the Tulpar. And honestly, just fixing even just one of the issues could have resulted in a totally different outcome. To give a quick little synopsis of it, the game takes place on a space freighter ship called the Tulpar. The crew consists of about 5 people: Curly, the captain; Jimmy, the co-captain; Anya, the medic; Swansea, the mechanic; and finally the intern Daisuke. Hired by Pony Express, they have to deliver unknown cargo to a destination, which takes around about a year. Everything gets turned on its head when one of the crewmates crashes the ship, leaving them all stranded in deep space. It's a very simple retelling, but I'll explain more of the story as we go. But now, this is your final chance to check out the game because I'm going to dive into some heavy spoilers to analyze the crew. Alright, if you're still here, let's dive right into it, and we gotta start with the elephant in the room. Jimmy. He's obviously the main issue. He's the person that crashes the ship on purpose, killing all the crewmates either directly or indirectly. He's the source of all the main story's problems. As for the reason why Jimmy crashed the ship, it was because he couldn't face the consequences of his own actions. Early on in the story, we get hints that Jimmy wasn't a good person back on Earth. We don't really know what he did, but taking this job was supposed to be his second chance, a redemption if anything. Sadly, it seems like he didn't learn any lessons, because we find out while on the ship that he actually ends up assaulting Anya, the medic, which sends her into a full-blown mental breakdown after finding out that she's actually pregnant now. She tells this to the captain, and Curly goes to speak with Jimmy about what happened, and that's when Jimmy decides to crash out, literally and figuratively. He really tried to kill everyone just so he didn't have to go back to Earth. He ends up failing, and he obviously doesn't feel remorse for his actions because that was only the first 15 minutes of the game. It only gets worse from here. His stunt starts to snowball the story. First, with Curly getting seriously injured trying to stop the crash, but he ends up taking the brunt of the explosion. Curly's now bedridden for the rest of the game, needing help just to live, and it's at the cost of him being in extreme pain. Now, Jimmy gets a promotion to be the captain of the ship, but he constantly ignores and degrades Anya to the point where she has to take her own life because she couldn't bear the thought of giving birth to his child. The intern Daisuke, on the other hand, is manipulated by Jimmy into his death. To give a brief explanation of that, when Anya was about to take her life, she ends up locking herself in the med bay, making the only possible way in was to crawl through a vent in the maintenance room. But these weren't vents you wanted to be near. These are the type of vents like Mangled would come out of. And of course, Jimmy was told multiple times that no one should go through these vents because of how dangerous they are. Just being the no good person that he is and using his newfound authority, he pressures Daisuke into the vents, giving him grave injuries when he comes out on the other side. Now Swansea, who couldn't bear to see his intern in that state, decides to put him out of his misery with a swift axe to the head. Now Swansea's involved and is at a boiling point after putting Daisuke out of his misery. This now leading to Swansea trying to murder Jimmy. Unfortunately, Swansea brings an axe to a gunfight and Jimmy then ends up killing him too. The story ends up with Jimmy trying to own up, I'm doing air quotes, to his actions by taking Curly and putting him in the cryopod to hopefully survive until someone can find him later on. Jimmy then takes his gun and kills himself, which once again is even a cruel ending because Jimmy forces Curly to survive even though he can't even live a normal life ever again. And Jimmy never even has to face the fallout of his own actions. It's kind of hindsight, but the whole decision to have Jimmy on the ship and much less give him that much power as vice captain was a terrible move. One, because he has no leadership qualities to begin with. He was just brute forcing everything, bossing and manipulating anybody he could. He really just had no purpose of being on the ship other than to help pilot. Honestly, you could have replaced him with the company mascot. At least Polly could sing you a tune. I understand why he was there though. Him and Curly, they've known each other for a long time, and to be honest, I do believe people deserve a second chance. In Curly's mind, he was trying to help shape him to be a better person. But the one thing you have to remember is that only works if someone is there to be the mold of the shape when needed. And no one helped guide Jimmy into the direction he should have been going for his redemption arc. They just let him run wild and do anything he wanted to, probably the same thing that happened back on Earth. Which kind of breaks into the second biggest downfall of Tulpar, the crew's lack of care and enablement of Jimmy's actions. This part here, the crew does hold some of the blame because no one checked Jimmy. No one called him out for his behavior or actions. They just let him run amok until it was already too late. And just seeing how everybody interacts with each other, I say this is due to everyone just going with the flow and only caring about what their specific job on this ship was. In normal cases, I would say this is fine because you're hired to do a certain job. But this doesn't apply when working closely is a loose term with this bunch. They're basically all living with each other for an extended period of time. It's one thing to come into work and see the same coworkers every day, not really caring what they do because you can clock out at the end of the day. It's a whole nother matter to wake up and brush your teeth next to these people for a whole year. Ignoring these unspoken rules builds tension and you can just see it's ready to snap, especially after the crash. For example, Jimmy treats Anya like an eyesore the whole game, ignoring her opinion every chance he can get. But that doesn't just stop at Jimmy. You can also see the rest of the crew doing the same thing to her. Swansea can be seen throwing jabs at Anya because she almost had an accident with the same maintenance vent that ends up killing Daisuke in the future. But he also throws in sly remarks and implies that Anya isn't good at her job, calling her a so-called nurse. To put the icing on the cake, Swansea even admits to Jimmy that he's known about the assault, but he really just didn't care about anything that went on in the ship. The only time we actually see Swansea react to anything is when Daisuke dies. Then, and only then, does Swansea try to kill Jimmy, which is interesting because he's probably known Anya way longer than he's known Daisuke, but didn't show any signs of actually wanting to stand up for Anya. To dive a little bit more into Swansea's character, I think he really didn't want to stand up for Anya because to some level he empathized with Jimmy. Back on Earth, he was in somewhat the same boat of wasting his life away, but this time, his second chance, he decided to take it on himself. And he decided to get his life together, start a family, really just try to make it better for his kids so they don't have to live the same life he does. So it explains why he showed the most extreme emotion for Daisuke, because he saw pretty much his children in Daisuke. But it's still weird because he empathizes with Jimmy by not actually trying to set him straight like he did himself. Instead, he sat there being a bitter old man, just showing anger and disdain for his job and crewmates the whole time, instead of actually just being more open and real about what he was actually feeling. Even though it seems like he cared about Daisuke in some way, the whole time Daisuke was alive, he was constantly talking down to him, even though Daisuke was just new and trying to learn the ropes. And like I said before, he really just let Jimmy do what he wanted, and he didn't really help Anya in any way and even talk down on her. However, I will note that Swansea never really talked bad about Curly. He only really talked bad about the company Pony Express, which is an interesting point to note and something we're going to come back to about that. Moving to the next crew member, Daisuke, there really isn't much to say about him. He's the newest of the crew, only joining this very trip and at the last minute. He was the fresh air the crew needed that could have actually helped set them straight, but sadly he just ended up falling in line to this unspoken tension once again, trying to befriend everybody and not really butt heads. With his character, we get small glimpses of why he decides this, talking about how he doesn't want to disappoint his parents and not be seen as a failure, so it makes sense of why he fell in line. But knowing all this, regretfully, he just ends up telling this information to the wrong person because Jimmy, knowing this insecurity, just made it easy for him to manipulate. Not to mention, he's also just the new guy at the end of the day, so he probably wouldn't even have much weight in the crew in their decisions. Next is Anya. She seems to have self-esteem issues, making her a target for people not to really take her seriously or just take advantage of. She's seen as a person that tries to stay out of the way while also trying to help where she can. And she's probably noted as one of the only characters that seem to speak up about problems within the crew. This is probably because she does the mental evaluations of the crew so she can see the cracks before or while they're forming. Yet, once again, no one pays her any mind. During one of Jimmy's rants, it's stated that she hasn't actually gone to med school and only finished nursing school. So I assume the crew uses that fact as a way not to trust her diagnoses. But you have to understand, even still, this is the only medic on board, anyone with medical training at all, for a year-round trip, 365 days. It's crazy to ignore her in just any capacity. But the constant beratement and bashing of the team just caused a lot of stress, and you can see that stress only increased after her assault. And keep in mind, this is all before the crash, so they're having a normal voyage, but now the tensions are rising even further, and it makes sense why Anya decides to go and take the emergency gun case and hide it so Jimmy just couldn't get his little grubby paws on it. And because Anya did that, it sends the final crewmate, Curly, into a panic trying to find it. Now to shift the gaze to Curly, him being the captain of the Tulpar, honestly, once again, means nothing. Because the leadership just isn't there. The two captains of this ship just really didn't do anything but make everything worse. Curly's role as captain isn't really seen in the game, other than him having to unlock items like the axe or keep track of items like the emergency gun. He's pretty much just doing inventory the whole time. Even when talking to the crew, he doesn't really display leadership qualities. Curly's seen multiple times blowing off Anya when she brings up Jimmy. Most of these scenes just showing how very little he gets involved with the actual crew he's supposed to manage. Especially with Jimmy's antics, because you can see him zone out every time it's brought up. He's obviously always trying to turn a blind eye to keep this imaginary sense of peace, which is the worst thing you can do as a leader. We even get a scene in game with Anya and Curly talking about the screen in the common room. Anya says that she sees a dead pixel somewhere on the screen. Curly speaks up and says he doesn't see it at all. The scene just echoes the sentiment of the ship that Curly only wants to see the quote-unquote bigger picture and ignoring the finer details like Jimmy, Curly's role in all this, and especially Pony Express. And that's probably because Curly is just a proxy of the Pony Express. He acts like the HR of the ship, but once again, he only does what's best for the company and helps himself. Everyone else be damn. Kind of like HR. You can even see that all the times he even defends Jimmy, he really isn't even protecting his longtime friend. It's honestly to protect himself. Time and time again, the game shows us that Jimmy is an unreliable narrator when you're playing as him. However, when you're playing as Curly before the crash, we get a scene where Jimmy gets pissed at Curly, and how he describes Curly is actually spot on for his character. I believe because Jimmy and Curly are supposed to mirror each other as characters, so it makes sense that Jimmy has the best read on Curly. But to explain the scene, Curly tells the crew that they've lost their jobs and they're all getting laid off. This doesn't sit right with Jimmy and he goes into his usual outburst. But Jimmy is correct in saying that Curly doesn't care what's happening. Curly really doesn't seem that worried altogether. The most worry we see in him is just him trying to figure out how to break the news to the crew. So it seems more spot on that Jimmy is correct, even though it's out of jealousy, that Curly just plans to fall back on his accomplishments. Compared to the rest of the crew, career-wise, it seems that he's leagues ahead of them, and him landing another job is probably only a matter of time. Or he could possibly even keep climbing the corporate ladder, even at Pony Express. So when we get scenes of Jimmy and Curly, Jimmy is constantly calling out Curly for looking down on him, and it's kind of true in a sense. Curly was just honestly there to observe the crew for the company and make sure nothing happened to the cargo. I will say karma did come for him when the ship crashed and he was caught in the blast. Now he was actually left to be an observer of the crew, but this time his power was stripped from him. Kind of showing how quick he could fall off that same corporate ladder he was so high up on. Moving away from the crew, we can't talk about the corporate ladder without the last and final nail in the coffin. Pony Express. These unfortunate few were always doomed in some form or fashion because they decided to work for Pony Express. This is obviously a very evil company that only thinks of how to profit. The easiest sign to see of this was in their products, the mouthwash. The cargo that they were supposed to deliver a year from now was mouthwash. But the thing is, the mouthwash wasn't even viable as mouthwash. We're told in the game that the sugar content was so high in the mouthwash that it can't even be used as a disinfectant. Hence the reason we see Swansea decides to start using it as a drinking alcohol just to get drunk. Even though on the bottle it says it kills 99.9% of germs. If that was true, it should be like him drinking hand sanitizer. But when it comes to Pony Express, the list doesn't stop with false marketing. The workers in the company barely have any benefits. The crew quarters don't have standard things like locks on their bedroom doors, but there are locks in the medical bay and the cargo container. It just goes to show safety isn't a priority to Pony Express unless it's safety of their goods. Another example would be the cryopods. They're supposed to be used in an emergency like what happened in the game. It seems like they couldn't stick to protocols because they should have the same matching number of cryopods as to crewmates. But in the game, we only see 4 pods because there are only supposed to be 4 crewmates. But the company approved and let Daisuke on at the last minute. So even if none of the cryopods broke during the crash, someone was bound to die on that ship because they had to be left out. There are many more examples of how Pony Express cut corners, but I'm just giving you a few just to show the terrible conditions the team was in to begin with. If you ask me, honestly, it's a miracle that the Tulpar crew was this lucky to make it this close to retirement. So yes, while the actions of one person caused the beginning of the end, this story was already written. Unfortunately, it was just written among and lost in the stars.